Welcome to the podcast for Westside, a Jesus Church. We hope this teaching encourages and empowers you to love, learn, and live the way of Jesus.
So we're in John 1. We're going to pick it up in verse 14 today. Fasten your seatbelts. There's a ton of stuff I want to share with you. And I hope and pray it just speaks to your heart and is encouraging for you. Verse 14, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Let me hear you all say, the Word became flesh. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me.' Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father. He has made him known." So a few weeks back, I kicked off the Gospel of John, and we had a look at John 1, verse 1, where it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And we saw how the word in the Greek language, which is the original language of the New Testament, is the word logos. Let me hear you say logos. Logos was a really profound and developed system of philosophical thinking that really Heraclides began to develop. Heraclides, he was a Greek philosopher, and when you read some of his works, it's fascinating what he says about the structure of reality and the nature of the universe. He believed, and this was actually counterintuitive for his day, but he believed that at the core of the universe is energy. So he used the analogy of fire. He said everything's burning up and moving and changing and chaotic. He was the one who said you never step into the same river twice. And yet, Heraclides taught that even though everything is changing around us and at the heart of ultimate reality is chaos, he said there's something that's holding it together. Now, Heraclides didn't claim to know what that thing was, but he believed there was some force, some power, some cosmic mind. He used the word logos, not a personal God, but rather kind of a distant and removed God, that this thing that lied behind what we see in the physical world. And he said that thing, this logos, is what's holding everything together. I think Chinese philosophy of the Tao, very similar overlapping ideas. Now, I would argue that many people today in 2018 have a similar perception of the divine, where they see God as less of a person to know and more of a power to tap into, that God is somehow distant and removed. We don't know who he is, but somehow, some way, he's responsible for everything. I think about what Einstein said. In fact, Einstein, he said that people believe in two different kinds of gods. He says the God who is personal, that is the God who you believe in, the God that you pray to, the God who cares about your life, the God who answers your prayers. Einstein said that's one category. But then he said there's others who believe in a different kind of God, and Einstein actually put himself into this category. It's the God of the philosophers. It's the unknowable God. It's the God that's behind the beauty and structure and symmetry of the world. Check out this quote by Einstein. He said, "I believe in Spinoza's God." Spinoza, of course, was that 17th century rationalist who was really spearheading a lot of the Enlightenment thinking. He said, that's the God I believe in, who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists, not so much in a God who concerns himself with the fates and actions of human beings. So we could put it this way, Einstein, he's more of a deist and less of a theist. A deist is someone who believes that in the beginning there was this being who started the universe, who kind of wound it up like a clock, but then this being stepped away from the universe, doesn't really care about the universe, and therefore we can't know this being. Einstein, he had this deistic perception of God, whereas a theist would say, yeah, there's a creator God, but this creator God actually loves us and knows us and cares about us, and therefore we can know and care about this God as well. Now, many people, I think, have similar perceptions of the divine, just like Einstein. Michio Kaku is one example. He is a physicist. He's an incredible author and thinker. I love his works. But he wouldn't consider himself, I don't think, a theist. He would call himself a deist in the Einsteinian sense. He recently gave a talk. You can look at it online if you want. But he said that the universe is incredibly symmetrical. It's beautiful. It's also simple, and you can take all the complex ideas and the mathematics that are behind the universe, and he said you can actually summarize all of it in just a simple equation that's only an inch long. And Michio Kaku, he said, when you look at the laws of physics, when you look at the behavior of subatomic particles, it reflects, his words, quote, the mind of God. Now, what is that mind of God? Who is this God? Well, he would say, we don't really know, but it's out there somewhere. I think of Jordan B. Peterson. He wrote this book called 12 Rules for Life. Incredible book, mind-blowing, mind-bending book. He's a psychologist up in Canada. And he, I think, would be considered at least a deist, maybe a theist. I don't know, it's a little hazy. But he had a fascinating conversation just in the last couple months with Sam Harris. Now, Sam is pretty clear on where he stands when it comes to issues of God and faith. He's more a hardcore atheist, materialist. And so him and Jordan B. Peterson up in Vancouver, Washington, had this huge debate. Thousands of people were there. You can look it up on YouTube if you want later. But they're talking about, does God exist, and what is this God like? And Sam Harris, he believes there is no such thing as a God. But Jordan B. Peterson, he believes there's something out there. And at one point in the conversation, Sam Harris, he asked him, he said, well, just tell me then, what is your definition of God? And Jordan B. Peterson, in just his kind of classic, beautiful and yet circular and fascinating psychological way of speaking, he said this. I'll just read to you some of his definition. He said, God is truthful speech that rectifies pathological hierarchies. God confronts the chaos of being and generates habitable order. God is the highest value in the hierarchy of values. God is what calls and what responds to the eternal call to adventure. God is the voice of conscience. And he went on like this for several minutes. And when he was done, Sam Harris is like, well, I could believe in a God like that. That actually sounds pretty cool to me. Now, here's the deal. Whether it's Peterson or Einstein or Michio Kaku or others, they believe in this God that is out there, but they don't know what it's like. Beautiful definitions, compelling language. But when you keep God at a distance, if God is untouchable and unknowable, then in what sense does this God actually engage with the aches and longings of your life? God kind of becomes the equivalent of, I don't know, the Force in Star Wars, right? Where we kind of know it's there, but unless you're Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker, then we really don't know how to reach it. And it seems, I think this is universal, that deep in our DNA is this awareness that God exists. But for some people, they're trying to keep God at an arm's length. Now, I think this is why, for thousands of years, humans have always built temples. What's a temple? Well, you look in anthropology, even to this day, but especially in the ancient world, a temple is a drive to differentiate between secular and sacred spaces. So a secular space would be the physical domain, right? It's earth and dirt and work and sex and s'mores, like all these things, the world that we inhabit, the world we live in. And yet there's been this thinking for thousands of years, okay, if there's a God out there, the God doesn't care as much about those types of things. So what we're going to do is build a separate space where God exists. We'll build a temple. We'll build a structure. And of course, the upside to building a structure and saying that's where God exists is that God then is trapped inside the structure, and you don't have to worry that this God is going to tell you what to do in your everyday life. So there's been this drive to, okay, let's differentiate between secular and sacred. In fact, when John wrote the book of John, there was actually a temple that was funded by Herod in the city of Jerusalem. And the temple there, it was divided, because temples many times will divide sacred from secular. And it was divided into 3 different parts. So you have what was called the outer court. And this is where everyone would gather and they'd worship together. It didn't matter who you were, what your background looked like. You were welcome to be in the inner or outer court. But then you had the inner court. And the inner court was more for the priests. It was for the paid professionals. But there was one more part to the temple, and it was called the Holy of what? Holies. Now, the Holy of Holies, they believe this is where the presence of God was. This is where the glory of God resided. But here's the deal. Because God's glory, God's power, this sacred space is so profound and so otherworldly, we don't have the capacity to experience God in that way. So what they did is they separated the inner court from the Holy of Holies. It says, you can read this in the Old Testament, there was a veil that hung down. And for years I used to think veil in terms of like kind of a sheet that hung down or hippie beads or whatever. But when you read the Old Testament, you find actually, no. It was much more than that. It was this thick curtain, inches thick. It took many, many priests just to hang it up. No one could go into the Holy of Holies. No one could go past the veil, with one exception. There was one guy, once a year, the high priest, on the day of Yom Kippur. He and he alone could go past the veil and experience the presence of God. But because God is so holy and we are not, what that high priest would do in the days leading up to that encounter with God is he would make sacrifices. He would confess his sin, because they believed if you had sin in your life and you go into the presence of God, then you would actually die. And he didn't want to die. And so he's spending all this time confessing. Now you can only imagine how intense that time of confession would be. Have you ever been in those prayer circles, maybe your community group or with a group of people at church or whatever, and then someone says, and it's always kind of awkward, hey, let's have a time of confession, right? And so you're sitting there, and have you noticed that in those prayer groups, the confession is always like so lightweight and so trivial? People are like, oh, you know, I'm sometimes I'm late for work. Okay, that's my big confession. I don't pray as much as I should. Or what's your confession? Oh, yesterday I liked my own Instagram post. Okay, you're like, really? That's what you struggle with? Okay, great. But I guarantee if you were about to go into the presence of God, if you were about to enter the Holy of Holies, your prayers would look nothing like that. Now, you'll be on your knees and there's tears and you're just dredging up everything because, again, this guy didn't want to die. The day came, Yom Kippur, he goes past the veil into the Holy of Holies, but even then, he still wore this special robe that had bells attached to it. So it's so classic. The other priests would be on the other side of the veil, and they're listening because if the bells are ringing, that means the guy's still alive. He's walking around, he's talking, he's praying, he's encountering God. But if suddenly the bells stop and they hear a thud, well, there goes Bob. I guess that's what you get for being a Patriots fan, right? No, I'm kidding. Sort of. So the guy dies. And then what do you do? Because no one else wants to die. So they actually tied a rope to this guy's ankle. And so they would just pull him out. All right, well, who's next? No one wanted that job. So they believed that there was this presence of God, the glory of God, but it was obscured. It was behind a veil, and to experience this living God, this creator God, this God of all power and all knowledge and all wisdom, well, you got to make sure you're in the right place. Isn't it interesting that we'll come to a space like this because we want to encounter God, we want to meet God, whether it's here at this church or in your own times of worship or seeking God as you open your Bibles first thing in the morning. We'll come into a place to encounter the Holy of Holies. We'll come into a place to experience God's goodness and presence, but we don't really care. We take it so lightly and so trivially, and it's not that big a deal. And yet in the ancient world, they had this sense of wonder. They had this sense of awe, where we get the word awesome. God is here, and I want to make sure I am in the right space. So God was perceived to be behind a veil. God is hidden. God's out there. He's orchestrating the universe, but we don't really know this God in a personal way. So I would argue we see this in anthropology. We see this in some of the structures of ancient temples. We see this for sure in Greek philosophy. Think Heraclitus. But we also see this, and this is worth writing down, by the way, we see this in what is called Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism comes from a word gnosis in the Greek, which means to know, where we get the word knowledge from. And what Gnosticism taught is that, and this is huge in John's day, by the way. We'll be talking about this at different points as we go through the Gospel of John. But when John was writing these words describing Jesus, it was one of the fastest growing religions / philosophies of the ancient world. What did they teach? Well, Gnostics taught that there's a God out there somewhere. We don't know this God. We can't really connect with this God. But also, the Gnostics said there are lesser gods. Aeons, they called them. These lesser gods, these lesser deities. And they said one of these deities is called the Demiurge. Sounds like Stranger Things. And this Demiurge, the Gnostics taught, was evil. He's an evil god. And out of the evil places of his heart, he decided to create physical reality. So the Gnostics said ultimate reality is spiritual, but the Demiurge decided to create the physical world. And so he made the world in which we inhabit, blood and soil and human bodies. Now, this is basically dualism, because what Gnostics taught is that the spiritual is good. If something's spiritual, it's good, but if something is physical, including, by the way, your own physical body, they said it's evil. Anything physical, matter, your body, it's wrong. It's opposed to God. Thus, the only way they taught that you could know the divine, the only way you could obtain enlightenment, was by renouncing the physical, moving past the physical, and beginning to tap into the spiritual. Now, what did that look like practically? I think for some people, and you see this for sure in the first 3-4 centuries. Sadly, part of this began to creep into certain sectors of the church, but for some it meant asceticism, where what they would do is say, well, if my physical body is evil, if it doesn't matter, then I need to beat my body, I need to harm my body, I need to hurt my body, I need to starve my body, because if I do that, then maybe I could obtain this enlightenment, moving past it, transcending it, and maybe I'll reach this blissful place. Once I conquer pain, I can experience God. I think of Simon Stylites, interesting name. And Simon Stylites, that was his thinking. Okay, the physical world is bad, so I need to leave the physical world. I need to rise above the physical world. So what Simon Stylites did is he built a tower. The tower was 30 feet tall. He climbed up this tower and he said, I'm going to live here denying my body, only eating very basic things, sleeping in a very hard place to sleep, out in the elements, and I'm going to live up here. For 37 years, Simon Stylites lived on a tower because he thought if I just leave the physical world, somehow I can access the divine. Now, for some people, you study history, that is their posture towards spirituality. When I was in India a few years ago, I certainly saw aspects of this, how people long to connect with God, and the only way they feel they can do it is somehow to harm themselves. For others in the ancient world, it wasn't so much asceticism, it was hedonism. So their thinking was, well, if the divine is spiritual and we are physical, and the physical is evil or wrong, then ultimately physicality doesn't matter. Ultimately, our body doesn't matter. So the hedonist taught, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Hey, get drunk, sleep around, do whatever you want, party like it's AD 89. Like, this is the thinking of the hedonists, because, hey, if it's all about spiritual things and the divine doesn't really care, and it's just made by a demiurge, then we can do what we want with our life. Now, I would actually argue, skip ahead 2018, that we are seeing a resurgence of Gnosticism today. You think about how many people have a similar perception of the divine where, okay, God's out there, he's this distant being, we don't really know what it is or what it does, but it's there in some sense. Or think about how many people we know that like to call themselves spiritual, but not what? Religious, which sounds nice. It's very Zen, it's very Portlandy, right? Hey man, do you go to church? Oh, no. Well, do you believe in God? Oh yeah, I believe there's a God. I'm spiritual, man. I'm just not religious. 41% of Portlanders, 41% consider themselves to be spiritual but not religious. But here's the deal. When you begin to probe at that a little bit and begin to think that through and ask them questions, no one really knows what it means, right? It just sounds so good and green and all that, but how does this change your life? And how do you know this God? And how do you access this God? And how do you know what's right? And how do you know what truth and justice really is? OPB, Oregon Public Broadcast, they recently did an article on this. You got to check out this quote from the article, and you can find it online. But I think it summarizes where we're at as a city. Oregonians are very spiritual. But many do not belong to a faith community, which, by the way, that's true. We are tied with Seattle and San Francisco as one of the least churched cities in our nation. So many do not belong to a faith community. They have a connection to something greater than themselves through the ocean and the mountains. You know within your inner core that there is something important here, and it guides your life at a certain level. Now, before I beat up on this, let me just say that first of all, this is actually a huge missional opportunity for us. Wasn't it Leonard Cohen who said there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in? And I think this really gets at the crack of secularism, what we see in our own city, because people can look on the outside at a city like ours and think, oh, it's just so dark and no one cares about God. Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that. It's funny, at this pastor's conference, hundreds of pastors there, every guy I met virtually, they're like, so you're from Portland, man, I'm praying for you, right? That was their response. It was so funny. And I'm like, wait a minute. Okay, yeah, sure, I understand the perception and I understand the stereotype. But here's the good news. This is a city that is bursting with longing for the divine. This is a city that recognizes that secularism can only take you so far. This is a city that is filled with people who have, sure, hazy misconceptions about what God is like, but the longing for God, the desire for God hasn't gone anywhere. In fact, I think it's stronger in our city than other places where I've seen, where instead of apathy, there truly is a desire and a yearning. But here's the question that I have, and especially that last line, where he says that you know within your core there's something important there. And it guides your life at a certain level. And the question I would have to that is, okay, it guides your life at a certain, how? Like, what does that actually mean? If you believe in some cosmic deity, the divine, the universe, capital U, universe, whatever you think, how does that being, he, she, it, really guide you? How does this God shape your life? What does your God have to say about decision-making and marriage and singleness and truth and justice and love? When you actually begin to deconstruct this, what you find is that it's basically relativism dressed in spiritual clothes, or Gnosticism 2.0. And the driving ethos then, and it's no surprise, of our city is, hey, just do what you want, man. Like, we're tolerant, we're progressive, we're open-minded, which means do whatever you want, and if you really want to slap God on as a justification, go for it, right? Now, there's this British journalist. His name is Steve Turner, and Brilliant, sharp guy, he wrote this satirical poem describing this kind of relativistic mindset. You can look it up online if you're interested later. He calls it creed. And this is what Steve Turner says we believe in. He says, this is our culture right now. We believe in Marx, Freud, and Darwin. We believe everything is okay as long as you don't hurt anyone, to the best of your definition of hurt and to the best of your knowledge. We believe in sex before, during, and after marriage. We believe in the therapy of sin. We believe that adultery is fun. We believe that taboos are taboo. We believe that everything's getting better despite evidence to the contrary. The evidence must be investigated, and you can prove anything with evidence. We believe that Jesus was a good man, just like Buddha, Muhammad, and ourselves. He was a good moral teacher, though we think his good morals were basically bad. We believe that all religions are basically the same. They all believe in love and goodness. They only differ on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation. Now, it goes on. You got to check it out. It's so brilliant. But it reminds me, and I think Voltaire kind of summarized this well. Voltaire, the Enlightenment thinker, he said, in the beginning, God created man in his own image, and man has been trying to repay the favor ever since. That is so true of our cultural moment. This is true of our city. This is true of our neighbors, our coworkers. This is where we're at. But here's the tension. When you try and make a God in your image, when you try and make a God into whoever or whatever you want it to be, 99% of the time, because you're making it in your image, 99% of the time, that God is going to look a whole lot like you. And that can actually be really convenient. Oh, my God thinks like me. My God votes like me. My God has the same interests as me. My God has the same morality as me. My God will never judge me. My God will never tell me what's right or wrong. My God will never challenge me. My God will never push me into change. Tim Keller, he said, if your God never disagrees with you, then you might just be worshiping an idealized version. Let's get on the screen. You might just be worshiping an idealized version of yourself. That's money right there. If all you're doing is worshiping an idealized version of yourself, first of all, it's incredibly lonely. And it's ineffective because it's just you. You're staring at yourself in the mirror. But even more, a self-made God can't do anything when you're in the trenches of life, when you're facing bankruptcy or disease or divorce. You see, deep down, this quasi-awareness and belief that there's something out there, we long for something more. What we need, what the human story is pushing for and searching for, is not a deistic God, but a personal God. A God who's with us, a God who's among us, a God who loves us, a God who cares for us. We thirst for that. We ache for that. Sure, Logos, Tao, the Force, the God of Einstein, being spiritual but not religious. Okay, some start there, but it's not enough. We need more than that. And this is where John chapter 1 is absolutely explosive and revolutionary, because he begins in John 1 verse 1, in the beginning was the Logos. John starts there, which, by the way, is a great starting point when we're sharing with people who have hazy conceptions about who the divine is. Okay, you believe in something. You believe that there's some reality out there. You believe there's some cosmic mind that's holding it all together. Heraclitus, Logos. John says, okay, we can start at this point, but then he takes it a whole level deeper. Which brings us to verse 14, and he says, that Logos, that thing that you believe in, this is what you need to know. The Word became flesh, and he dwelt among us. This is the game changer. John says the God that you intuitively know is there, The God that anthropologists study when they look at the human story and our attempts to reach the divine. The God that your neighbor is trying to understand. That God exists, but he's not just far off. He's not just some distant being, but he's here. This God came to us. He walked among us. He walked our streets. The Word became flesh. Now, the word flesh in the Greek language is the word sarx. Let me hear you say sarx. It means flesh, skin, body, blood. The Word became flesh, and he dwelt among us. The word dwelt is the word skinu. Let me hear you say skinu. And skinu means tabernacled. Now, the word tabernacled should hopefully ring a bell because this is what you find in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the Jewish people are set free from slavery in Egypt. They're on their way to the Promised Land. And yet, because of their disobedience, for 40 years, they're wandering around in the desert. They're searching for God. They're waiting for God to make a way for them. And they wanted a place to worship. And so they created a portable temple called a tabernacle. Now, the tabernacle, externally, if you looked at it, it was very, very simple, minimal. It was covered with badger skins. It was basically a glorified tent. But on the inside of the tabernacle, it was incredibly lavish and beautiful. It was gold and precious stones, and it was there inside the tabernacle, they said, the glory of God resided. It's inside the tabernacle that one person once a year can go and meet this God who split open the Red Sea, to meet this God who gave us his commands from Mount Sinai. God resides in this tabernacle. So for hundreds of years, they had this perception of God, that God lives here. But John says, actually, when Jesus came to earth, he was the tabernacle. Simple, human, but inside containing the glory of God. And when you look at Jesus, you see what the glory of God is like. When Jesus shows up and walks our streets, every perception of God that we had was absolutely transformed, revolutionized. The Word became flesh. The Logos became living. And then he says this, oh my gosh, I love this line. We have seen his glory. Now, the word glory is the word doxa in the Greek language, the language of the New Testament, and it's the word kavod. It looks like kabod, but it's kavod in the Old Testament. Glory, we have seen his glory. It means the weight of God, the essence of God, the substance of God, the fullness of God, the presence of God. Kavod is related to another word, kavet, which is a word they would use to describe someone who's loaded down with jewelry. You're like, man, that cat's got some kavet. Look at that. They're obviously well off, right? They've got the presence, man. They've got the glory. They've got the weight. And they believed that the glory of God was something that only one person could experience. But when Jesus shows up, it's the glory of God in the flesh. One of the very first times that you see the word glory, this is worth writing down too, is in Exodus chapter 33. So you have Moses, who's leading the children of Israel. He goes up Mount Sinai. He gets the 10 Commandments, and he comes back down to give to the children of Israel. You guys know the story. What are the children of Israel doing when Moses comes down the mountain? Yeah, they're worshiping a golden cow, which would be so demoralizing. So he's away just for a little over a month. He comes back, and it says they're all naked. They're like singing and making sacrifices to a cow. Like, I can only imagine how demoralizing that would be to pastor that congregation. I was gone last Sunday in California. If I came back this week and Keithan had set up a golden cow and you're all like dancing around it, I'd be like, okay, time to move on, right? Like, it's utterly like horrific humor there. But like, wow, poor Moses. He's like trying to shepherd this congregation. He's trying to lead them to the promised land. And yet here they are. So what does Moses do? He's like, I'm going back up the mountain. I actually prefer the mountain to this. So he gets up on the mountain. His heart is heavy. He's overwhelmed. He's discouraged. And he prays something. Oh, write this down. Exodus 33, verse 18. God, show me your glory. Let me hear you say, show me your glory. God, thank you for the commandments. Thank you for your word written in stone, but what I'm really longing for is your glory, God. What I really need is more of you, God. What I'm really longing for, the aches and loneliness of my heart, is I want you. Give me the kavod. Give me your presence. I want to experience you. It's Blaise Pascal. It's that this void that's in our heart, he said, that can only be filled with God alone. Show me your glory. It's the same thing that David said in the book of Psalms, Psalm 90, verse 16. He said, let us, your servants, see you work again. Let our children see your what? Your glory. Man, I think if there's one prayer, one poem that summarizes the human story, it's that. Show us your glory. We believe you're there. We know that you exist, right? It's what Einstein spoke of. There's something out there. It's what the physicists understand, the God of the philosophers. We see harmony and structure to the universe, and the more we learn about the universe, whether it's through the telescope or the microscope, we see the fingerprints of the divine everywhere, and that's great, but God, we want something more. Show us your glory. Show us your glory. Tolkien, he said, we all long for Eden, and we are constantly glimpsing it. Our whole nature is soaked with the sense of exile. That is the crack where the light gets in. Because people in our city, whether they can articulate it or not, they feel that. Their deepest yearning, the poetry and ache of their heart is, God, show us your glory. The people that you work with that seem so jaded and cynical, and you're like, there's no way they're ever going to come to church, let alone believe in God. And yet the deep cry of their heart, whether they can articulate it or not, is, God, show me your glory. Your son that you've given up on because he's walked away from God and he's not interested in God and he's forging his own path and making horrific mistakes, and your heart's broken by that. But the deepest truth about him is this longing that David and Moses said, God, show us your glory. Your roommate that you've been trying to share with, that you've been praying for, and yet you can see the destructive path they're on. The truest thing about them is, God, show me your glory. Other religions, I would even argue, where we look at their sacrifices and their attempts to connect with God through temple and ritual. And we look at that, and there's one way of looking at it like, oh, they're so lost. But I think deep down, it's this ache, it's this longing. God, show us your glory. Politicians, athletes, celebrities, songwriters, homeless people, the poor, those pushed to the margins, the depressed, the lonely, the discouraged. It's the same prayer. God, show us your glory. And every one of us today in this room, every one of us, what you long for more than anything else is not a bigger paycheck or a better spouse or your dream job. The truest thing about you, the greatest ache of your heart is, God, show me your glory. In a single prayer, Moses brings together 1 billion human longings. Show me your glory. And what does God say? Well, again, you can go to Exodus chapter 33, and it's so interesting, this conversation that they have. Moses prays that, and then what does God say? Well, Moses, un problema. Moses was Spanish, evidently. Moses, you want to see my glory? Here's the problem. If you see my glory, you're going to die. No one can see my glory and live. Moses, your heart would stop beating on the spot. Your physical body just couldn't handle it. If I just showed up and appeared to you, that would be the end of Moses, ex-Moses. And I don't want that to happen to you because I've got a plan for you. So I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll show you a glimpse. I'll give you a taste of my glory. Hide behind the rock. I'll kind of cover you with my hand. I'll pass by. And Moses that day got the tiniest sliver of the glory of God. and it changed him. But this is fascinating. Moses had this yearning for God, the glory, the kavod, but the chasm between his humanness and frailness was too great. And doesn't this get at the core of the human dilemma? We long for God, we seek God, we desire God, but we don't know how to access this God. We don't know what this God looks like. It's like the little girl who someone told me this a couple years ago. I think it was their daughter, and she's sitting at a table, 5 years old, and she's drawing this picture, and her dad comes up to her, and he's like, "Sweetie, what are you drawing?" And she looks up at him, and she says, "Daddy, I'm drawing a picture of God." And the dad, he looks at her, he's like, "Well, that's cute, but no one really knows what God looks like. You can try, but we're really kind of hazy on what that would actually look like on a piece of paper." And she was kind of offended by that. 5 years old, and she looks at him, puts her hands on her hips, and she's like, "Well, Dad, they will know what God looks like when I'm done with this." And you see, that's the good news, because John is saying, sure, there's hazy perceptions. Sure, there's misunderstandings. Sure, there's a deep yearning in us. We long for Eden, Tolkien. And yet, through Jesus, we've actually seen what this God looks like. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And what's the very next thing he says? We have seen his what? The glory? Are you kidding me, John? The kavod? What Moses was screaming out to see when he was on the mountain? What David wrote about in the book of Psalms, what the priests in the tabernacle were trying to access, what people in our city are searching for, what other religions are striving for, what Einstein and Sam Harris and your spiritual but not religious neighbor ache for. The glory of God has come to us, and his name is Jesus. Jesus is the glory of God. Jesus is the God who comes down the mountain. Christianity is not about get up the mountain, do a better job. Maybe if you're holy enough, you can experience my kavod. No, Jesus is the God who comes down the mountains, who walked our streets, who tasted our pain, who knows what it's like to be hungry and thirsty and rejected and alone, who experienced racism and injustice. This is the God who has come to us. And this God, when he came to us, he didn't come to judge us or condemn us, but to love us and to heal us and to show us what this God is like. We have seen his glory. And what is his glory? He is full of grace and truth. That is the message that we get to share to the people in our lives that have confusion and misplaced ideas about who God is, to a city that's lonely and aching and seeking the glory in all the wrong places. We get to show what the glory is like. We get to bring near the God they seek. And we get to join this God, what theologians call the incarnation. We get to join in this God who comes down to us to bring us to him. We get to join this God on earth as it is in heaven to bring justice and healing and beauty and the gospel to the broken places of our world. You know, C.S. Lewis, he masterfully put it this way. He said, in the Christian story, God descends to reascend. He comes down to the very roots and seabed of the nature he has created. But he goes down to come up again and bring the whole ruined world up with him. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're like, okay, maybe that's interesting, maybe not. Something to underline, something to think through. But what does that actually mean for my singleness? What does this actually mean for my 9 to 5? How does this practically engage with my life? How does it affect my finances and my marriage and the decisions I have to make? What does this actually mean street level? And that's such a good question. And I'm so glad you asked it. But for the answer, you're going to have to come back next week as we look at part 2.